Hello Year 12, and this is our second lesson of the week, and as you know we are going back over forgotten content. We're going right back into the depths of paper 1, and in today's lesson I'd like you to focus on civil rights and minority freedoms. First of all, to begin with, let's think back to the civil rights legislation. So as we know, the key legislation was passed in 1964 and 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And what I'd like you to do is looking at all the key pieces of civil rights legislation. There is a condensed list on Show My Homework for you, but you may want to look back at your own notes. What do you think was the biggest victory for the civil rights movement? What areas were still not addressed by this legislation? And how much credit would you attribute the following groups for the success of this legislation? The President and Congress, so you can see Lyndon Baines Johnson there shaking hands with Martin Luther King. Would you give Martin Luther King and other key high-profile leaders in the civil rights movement the majority of the credit? Or what about the civil rights protesters, the students, the boots on the ground who were being arrested and spat on and treated disgustingly, but all of that created more sympathy for their plight and their cause, which forced the President's hand into passing this legislation? Who would you give the most credit for? And then a stretch and challenge question: why did certain legislation needed extending? What was not happening? Why was just passing this legislation not enough in America? So that's our first activity for today. And this should allow you then to try and plan this particular essay. How far do you agree that the civil rights leaders were the chief reason for the increasing success of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s? And what I'd like you to do is think about, and we did lots of work last lesson looking at what an excellent history AO1 essay looks like. And for this particular essay, it is one of the more straightforward types of essay, a causation section A essay, where you have to think of 3 or 4 different factors and causes for a particular event happening. So the event happening is the success of the civil rights movement, and what the examiner kindly does for you is give you a factor in the question, that is civil rights leaders. But you may also want to think about the media, legal action, direct action, police tactics and legislation. As we did last lesson, what structure do you need for this essay? What detail do you need to support your argument? What are the relationships that you will analyse? That is absolutely important that I have written down here. And what will your overall judgment be? So a detailed essay plan on this particular question, please. And then I'd like you to write a detailed essay plan for this question. How far do you agree that the aims and methods of Black American civil rights activists in the years 55 to 68 were radically different from those of activists in the years 1917 to 55? Now this, in many ways, is similar to the confidence and crisis essay that you planned last lesson. In every single paragraph, you will have to have information from 1955 to 68 and compare that to 1917 to 55. So you may want to compare the NAACP in both those time periods and its successes and how well it's doing. You may want to compare protest, you may want to compare key individuals, you may want to compare the government, violent protest, all of those different things. But you have to be comparing constantly in your essays. That's a tip from me. Think about your structure. What details are you going to need to support the arguments that you're making? What relationships are you going to analyse? Now this is, I think, a very good essay for relationships, in that the relationship between 1955 and 68 has to be compared and analysed with the information from 1917 to 55. So what was so different? What was similar? How were they different? And what is your overall judgment? So let's have a detailed essay plan on that, please. And finally, here is a third essay plan for you to complete. How far do you agree that the Montgomery bus boycott was the key turning point in the civil rights movement in the 20th century? So think about the Montgomery bus boycott, Northern migration, Brown versus Board of Education, Little Rock, Arkansas, the Northern Crusade, and the passing of the civil rights legislation. So how far do you agree that Montgomery bus boycott was the key turning point in the civil rights movement in the 20th century? Now, as we know, if you are given a fact in the question, then everything else in the essay must be compared to that fact in the question. So whether you bring up Little Rock or Brown versus Board of Education or Northern migration, you have to compare that to Montgomery bus boycott because that is the fact in the question. Excellent. So we've got quite a few detailed essay plans being made for civil rights, and that's wonderful to see. I'm sure we'll all remember when Lucille passed away. It was very sad. I'd like us to think about women now. We need to honour Lucille's memory. What was her final message to her grandchildren? What would she say about the position of women in society by 1980? What had the greatest impact on the position of women in society, and how much change was there really for women in the USA from 1970 to 1980? What is she going to say to, little Freddie, Dennis and Martha? What is she going to say about the impact that impacts that women had to endure during this time period, and what was the position of women in society by now? Factoring in women and factoring in civil rights, and you might also want to factor in homosexual Americans, Native Americans and Hispanic Americans. Maybe also draw from immigrants. To what extent was the USA a more tolerant society to become a more tolerant society in the years 1917 to 1968? Think about the different criteria for this question. What structure are you going to adopt? What are you going to have in your 3 paragraphs? What details you need to support your argument? What are the relationships that you will need to analyse? What will your overall judgment be? Now, for this particular essay, it's very, very broad. You won't be able to mention everything. But things you do mention, you need to mention in detail, analyse in detail, and compare consistently to other groups in society, other minorities. So it might be that comparison with women, to the civil rights movement, to immigration. And this is a very tricky essay, so we've saved the most difficult for last. So think about those factors when making this essay plan. So well done, Year 12. We'll be back onto Reagan next lesson, and we'll be going through your Reagan essays in detail. Hope you're all well. Goodbye.